Galileo's Leaning Tower Experiment by Wendy Macdonald and Paolo Roux. A science adventure. Massimo threw a stone off the bridge and watched it fall, plop, into the river. "Hey, Massimo, why don't you come with me?" called a boy, herding a flock of goats across the bridge. Massimo waved. "Thanks, but I have to wait for my uncle's boat." Massimo threw another stone. Plop! "That looks like a good game," a stranger said. "It's not really a game, sir," Massimo replied. "I'm watching how fast the stone falls." "What concerns you?" the man asked. "Because I'm waiting for my uncle," Massimo explained. "Every market day I have to drop this food for him to eat." He looked up the river. "Here comes his boat now." Massimo picked up a wheel of cheese and a loaf of bread. Just before the boat passed under the bridge, he dropped them. They landed on the boat with a single thud. "Strange how two things landed at the same time," the stranger said. "Of course they did," replied Massimo. "I wouldn't let my uncle's food fall into the river." "But the cheese is heavier. It should have fallen faster and landed first," the man said. He stroked his beard. Could Aristotle be wrong? "Good morning, Professor Galileo," a group of noisy students called out, laughing and pushing each other as they crossed the bridge. Massimo stepped away from the man. "You're a professor?" he asked. "I am," the man said. "But this morning it seems I am your pupil." As Galileo walked slowly away, the rowdy boys followed. Massimo walked to the marketplace to meet his sister, Angela. As they packed up the donkey cart, Massimo said, "I just met a professor from the university. He was very interested in how I dropped the bread and cheese onto Uncle's boat." "And why should he be interested in that?" Angela asked. "Those professors, they waste their time thinking." "Perhaps they do," admitted Massimo. "He didn't even know how to drop food from a bridge." All week, Massimo was busy with his chores on the farm. At the end of the week, he went to the bridge again. He smiled shyly when the professor walked up to him. "Are you dropping more food for your uncle?" Galileo asked. "Yes, sir," Massimo answered. "Here he comes." The boat moved swiftly down the river. Massimo waited for just the right moment. Then he dropped the bread and cheese. Galileo listened carefully as the packages again landed with one thud. He shook his head and asked, "How could Aristotle be so wrong?" "Is this Aristotle a friend of yours?" asked Massimo as they walked to the marketplace. The professor laughed. "Ha! I wish I had such a friend," he said. "Aristotle lived almost 2,000 years ago. Many people believe he was the smartest man who ever lived. He explained how and why things happen." "Like how things fall?" Massimo asked. "Exactly," Galileo replied. "He said that heavy things fall faster than light ones do. For the second time, you have shown me they do not." "I will tell you what I think," Galileo said, stopping at a fruit seller's cart. He picked up a pear and let it fall to the ground. "That pear fell because it had to," Galileo said. "The earth has a force that pulls all things toward it, unless—" he threw a grape in the air and caught it in his mouth, "unless something stops it as it falls." "Why did Aristotle say that things fall at different speeds?" asked Massimo. "I don't know," Galileo said, "but we know that the bread and cheese fell the same distance to the boat, and we heard them land at the same time too. So the speed of the fall must have been the same too." Galileo said goodbye, and Massimo walked over to where his sister was packing up to go home. "Who is that?" asked Angela. "That was Professor Galileo, the man I told you about," Massimo said. "He looks too young to be a professor," she said, frowning. Don't believe everything he tells you. Everyone knows that people only gain wisdom with age. That afternoon, Massimo told his donkey all about it. People say Aristotle was very smart, but I wonder if he ever tested his ideas. Then he would have seen what really happens. The donkey shook his head and snorted. Said Massimo. I've only tried dropping bread and cheese. Maybe other things fall differently. He found a hammer and a broken buckle. He held them up and let them go at the same time. I think they landed together, but I couldn't really tell, he said. Maybe I need to be higher up. Massimo climbed up to the roof and dropped the hammer and buckle again. They still seemed to hit the ground together. Angela came out to feed the chickens. What are you doing? She asked. Massimo told her about Aristotle and the speed of falling objects. Angela shook her head. If you ask me, this Aristotle was right. You know how slowly a feather falls. Let's try it, Massimo said. He picked up a chicken feather and dropped it with the hammer. The hammer fell straight to the ground, but the feather drifted lazily down. You're right, Massimo said, bowing his head. Things do fall at different speeds. Aristotle was as wise as everyone says. Oh, I must tell Galileo. The next day, Massimo looked for Galileo on the bridge and at the market. The professor did not appear. I must look for him at the university, Massimo decided. Shabby farm boys were not allowed at the university. But Massimo took a deep breath and walked into one of the huge marble buildings. Crowds of people stood everywhere, laughing and talking. No one noticed him. Massimo hurried through the courtyard. He stopped only to admire the statue with the letters carved in the stone below it. I wish I could read this, he said quietly as he ran his hands across the letter. What are you doing there? A voice growled. A large man loomed over him. I need to see Professor Galileo, Massimo croaked. We'll see about that, the man said. He took hold of Massimo and marched him through the halls. They stopped in front of an open doorway. Professor, the man said gruffly, this boy says he is here to see you. Galileo smiled. Ah, yes, my friend from the bridge, he said. Please come in. The man scowled and pushed Massimo into the room. Massimo stared at the books and the papers that filled the office. A thick book on the desk looked as if it had more words than all the ones he knew. What brings you here? Galileo asked kindly. I'm sorry to trouble you, Professor, Massimo began, but it looks as if Aristotle was right after all. He told Galileo about the buckle and the feather. Galileo chuckled. Interesting. I've been dropping things too. He handed Massimo a sheet of paper and a rock. Drop these. Massimo held them as high as he could and opened his hand. The rock fell onto the ground, while the paper floated slowly down, just like the feather. Galileo crushed the paper into a ball. Try it again. This time, both objects hit the floor together. What happened? Gasped Massimo. It's the air, Galileo replied. Air is all around us in what looks like empty space. A piece of paper has a large surface, so when you drop it, the air holds it up a little, and it takes longer to fall. Massimo nodded slowly. But by crushing the paper, you made the surface smaller, so the air didn't hold it up so much. He picked up the paper ball. The paper and the rock fell at the same speed. So Aristotle really was wrong. Yes, but I must prove it, Galileo said. It's not easy to change people's minds. You could show them by dropping things in front of them, Massimo said. Yes, but where? Galileo wondered. The bells in the old tower began to ring. The bell tower, Massimo exclaimed. It's the tallest building around. Galileo smiled. I will invite everyone from the university. Will you help me? The next day, Massimo hurried through his chores and went into town. Many people were already gathered around the tower. As Massimo walked through the crowd, he heard bits of angry conversation. Galileo is crazy. How dare he challenge the great Aristotle? I am named after Aristotle. I will not let this professor make a mockery of my name. Massimo found Galileo surrounded by teachers and students. The boy named Aristotle called out, "Professor, I am very interested in your demonstration. May I assist you?" As the boy bowed low, his friends snickered. Massimo made his way through the older boys. "I am here to help the professor," he announced. Galileo smiled at Aristotle. "Thank you, but I have an assistant." Galileo and Massimo rolled several cannonballs into the tower. The student named Aristotle stuck his head in the doorway and sneered at Massimo. "One of those balls weighs as much as you do. I will help." "No, thank you," Massimo said, and pushed the older boy out. Quickly, he swung the door shut and bolted it. One by one, Massimo carried the heavy cannonballs to the top of the tower. At the top, Massimo looked down at the sea of tiny, upturned faces. "Professor, it looks like as all of Pisa has come out to see your demonstration." He and Galileo set up 2 long boards. Between the boards, they placed a cannonball and a smaller musket ball. Galileo waved to the crowd and told Massimo to stand by ready. "Now!" Galileo shouted. They pulled away the board in front and pushed back the piece forward. The 2 balls rolled over the edge at the same moment. Time seemed to slow down as Massimo watched the balls fall. Then they hit the ground with a single thud. At first, there was complete silence. Then people began to argue about what they had seen. They started to chant, "Again! Again!" Galileo and Massimo repeated the demonstration over and over. Finally, even the student named Aristotle agreed. The large ball and the small ball landed together. They must have fallen at the same speed. When Galileo and Massimo came down from the tower, the crowd cheered. Galileo and Massimo shook hands. "Well done, my young friend," Galileo said. "You have helped uncover a great secret just by asking questions and paying attention to how things really happen. You have the kind of mind I enjoy teaching. Would you like to be my student?" "Oh, yes," Massimo answered. "There's so much I want to find out. How fast do things fall? Do they speed up on the way down? What happens if I throw something instead of just dropping it?" Galileo smiled. "At the university, you can explore all those things and more. Truly, you will help us observe common things in uncommon ways." This story takes place in 1589, an exciting time of many new scientific discoveries. At the age of 26, Galileo had just become a professor at the University of Pisa. He began doing experiments to explore how and why things move. Legend has it that Galileo dropped weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to test his ideas. Historians are not sure whether this event actually occurred because no eyewitness accounts exist. In this version of the story, Galileo and Massimo, a fictional character, compare the speed of 2